Hey guys, I'm Dov, and today I'm back with my much anticipated updated tier list. Now, of course, for those of you guys who saw my last tier list video, you'll know I'm not the biggest fan of tier lists at the end of the day. We'll go through why in just a minute, but I still feel that way, so as we get into this tier list, let's go ahead and keep a few things in mind. Now, why I don't like tier lists. So, for number one, in a game like Total War Warhammer, they are totally subjective. Different players have different opinions and perceptions. I myself, for example, am I wouldn't call myself an Empire main, but Empire is definitely the faction that I have the most experience with, so I might be biased towards them, for example. Other players who may main other factions might be biased towards them. Different players playing even in different regions sometimes have, you know, their own sub-metas and everything, so different players have different perceptions, and beyond the fact that these sort of things change all the time in different patches, even within a patch, a meta will evolve, sometimes devolve, and change over time, so it's really hard to nail down within a specific matchup a given meta, and it also is very much matchup dependent. A lot of factions have good matchups and bad matchups. There are a ton of other variables that go into it as well, like map type, player skill, so the point is I don't want you guys to draw too many conclusions because they might be incorrect. So you might even be asking why I'm doing this. Well, number one, it's more for fun than anything, and number two is just to sort of spark some discussion. You know, we can sort of talk back and forth. You guys can let me know what you think about my picks and everything here. So overall, I would say the game is reasonably well balanced. More so now than ever, despite the fact we have so many different factions in the game. There are some things that I think need to be changed, but we'll go ahead and get into that at a later date. Now, for how I have done this, there is a method to the madness. So, a little bit different from my last tier list. Rather than giving them a specific order, I've grouped them into tiers. Same as before, good matchups versus bad matchups are going to be tabulated. So, for a good matchup, a faction will get +1. For a bad matchup, it'll get -1. For an even matchup, it'll get a 0. And this is assuming 2 players of average skill level. At the high end and at the low end, this would be slightly different, but this is, again, based on my own perceptions. I don't consider myself a super high-level player, probably more experienced than many other players out there, but, you know, we're going to say, for the sake of this tier list, 2 players of average skill level. So, let's get to it, starting at the bottom with F tier in the struggle zone. And I had to put their icon on a white background because the F tier happens to be red. The sad SKAVEN. Yes, indeed. So they have no really favorable matchups in my eyes, and quite a few bad matchups. 9 bad matchups in total with Chaos, Dark Elves, Empire, Norska, High Elves, Vampire Counts, Tomb Kings, and Vampire Coasts. So you'll notice all 3 death factions on there, and then just a few others that tend to bring a lot of units that are hard for the SKAVEN to deal with. Generally, the biggest issue for the SKAVEN is their lack of mobility, their lack of mass, and their lack of leadership. Hopefully these will be remediated when the SKAVEN get their DLC, and they'll get more firepower to compensate, and hopefully some powerful regiments for now to give them some good unique abilities to sort of act as anchor units, but SKAVEN definitely not in the best place. Moving on to the next tier up, we are going to go to the D tier. This is the tier that, honestly, these guys aren't as bad as their ranking may seem, and this kind of goes back to why I don't really like tier lists in the first place. Beastmen and Lizardmen are honestly pretty solid factions, and it just kind of, because of the methodology I used here, they ended up not looking too great. So let's get into it here first with the Lizardmen. They don't have, again, any matchups that I would deem super favorable. Most matchups are going to be very even. In fact, they only have 4 matchups that are tilted, which is among the lowest of any faction. There's only one other faction that has that low amount of tilted matchups. So, again, their ranking makes them seem pretty terrible. They're really not as bad as it would seem. It's just that most matchups are very even. The bad matchups, Dark Elves, Wood Elves, because of their AP missiles and some of the tools they can bring, can be very hard. Same thing with the Dwarfs and the Tomb Kings as well. So, moving on. Beastmen are going to be up next in this tier. They have one good matchup, which is the High Elves. I find them to be pretty solid there. The Cygor, who is kind of obscured in the background there, is excellent against the High Elves, and just generally, because of their mobility and high model count, they can do very well in that matchup. In terms of bad matchups, again, all three Death factions, Beastmen tend to have leadership issues, so Vampire Counts, Tomb Kings, and Vampire Coast all are pretty tough for them to deal with. Likewise, Norska, weirdly enough, in my experience, has been really, really tough for the Beastmen to take down. Famir are just a nightmare to deal with because of their missile resistance, their heavy armor. They can just punch through, do a ton of damage. They also have a lot of good AoE damage spells that can clear out your light units. So, yeah, Beastmen tend to struggle against Norska from what I found. But, yeah, that's going to be it for the D tier. Moving on, we're going to start getting into the middle of the pack here in C tier. So, we're going to start with Norska themselves. They do have quite a few good matchups and bad matchups, coming in with a total score of -1, so not too bad actually. Good matchups, I find, for the Dwarves, because of their chariots. They have lots of really good AP and armor sundering. Pretty good matchup for Norska. The Beastmen, like I said before, they just can't really deal with Famir very well. Bretonnia, of course, again, Famir hard counter Grail Knights, and just in general, you're going to be very good at taking down heavy cavalry. SKAVEN are just terrible, so Norska, because of some of their chariots and so on, very good there. In terms of their bad matchups, Empire, they're so well balanced, and they have really good fire damage. They can outpace Norska. Vampire Counts and Vampire Coast can kind of grind you down through attrition. Wood Elves, because of their missiles, you know, it's tough for Norska to really... They're fast. They're not quite as fast as like the Beastmen, so it can be hard sometimes to compromise Wood Elf missile units. They also have really good tools for taking down some of the best Norskin units, like Famir and so on. And then the Greenskins are one of the best rush factions in the game, if not the best rush faction in the game, and Norska is also a rush faction, and they really can't do too much else too well, so in that situation, the Greenskins will just kind of stomp you in the face, and I found it's a relatively tough matchup for Norska, so coming in at a -1, not too bad. And speaking of the Green Tide, we're going to have them up here next. They have a couple good matchups. Norska, for one, as we mentioned, and the Dwarves. Because of your ability to mass Vanguard with a lot of armor-piercing anti-infantry troops, you can really just take the Dwarves to task. The Greenskins, again, only 5 tilted matchups. They may appear to not be that great because of their ranking in the C tier, but they're actually pretty solid overall with a lot of even matchups. In terms of their bad matchups, just the 3 Death factions, Vampire Counts, Tomb Kings, and Vampire Coast, because of that army-wide fear and the leadership issues you're going to run into, those are the 3 matchups that I think are tilted against the Greenskins' favor, but other than that, pretty much across the board, they really have a shot against just about any faction. So, moving on to the next tier, if I can find it here, there we go. Yep, we've got the B tier. So, this is where a lot of the factions are going to be, no pun intended. The meat of the factions here, we've got quite a few, all the Elves, Dwarves, and Bretonnia. So, let's get into it with the Dark Elves. They are the other faction that has the least amount of tilted matchups in my eyes. Only 4 tilted matchups with 2 good and 2 bad. They're good against the Lizardmen and the SKAVEN, the AP missiles, and again, against the SKAVEN they have chariots, excellent light cavalry. You have a really good infantry skirmish unit in Blackheart Corsairs in that matchup. Lizardmen, again, AP missiles and everything. The High Elves just outrange you in terms of their missiles, and they also have really good heavy cavalry, which tends to be the weakness of the Dark Elves. Bretonnia, same thing. That elite heavy cavalry just rolls over the Dark Elves for the most part. So overall they have a score of 0, so right smack dab in the middle. High Elves are going to be up next, and they have 4 and 4, again with a total score of 0. Good against the Dark Elves and the Wood Elves because you can outshoot them pretty effectively. The SKAVEN, again, heavy cavalry, chariots, all that jazz. And a Vampire Coast, similar thing. The High Elves are one of the few factions that can kind of stand and shoot against the Vampire Coast. Definitely easier said than done, but I do think it's a matchup that's decent for the High Elves, definitely favorable. In terms of their bad matchups, Chaos, you really just struggle to stand in melee against them, and you're also going to struggle to kite effectively. The Empire just will bring so many cost-effective troops and just flood the board with bodies that you're going to have a hard time dealing with everything. Beastmen, we kind of talked about before, and Bretonnia, again, good against pretty much all the elves because of their elite heavy cavalry. They can outnumber the high elves significantly, just like the Empire, and then those elite heavy cavalry, Grail Knights in particular, hard counter a few of your elite units as the high elves, so it's definitely a tough situation against the humans, but high elves still 0 score overall, so even and solidly B tier. The Wood Elves are up next, so all 3 of the elves smack dab in the middle, all very good, but they do require some skill to use. I will say that's true of all 3 of the elf factions. Wood Elves, good against Norska, Lizardmen, as we have mentioned, and the Vampire Coast. Again, they're one of the few factions that can stand and shoot against the Vampire Coast. They also can kite very effectively against the coast, so I would say that they're probably one of the best, if not the best faction to counter the zombie pirates, but in terms of bad matchups, Chaos, because of their strong rush, Big Bird, and just chariots and everything, they can be tough. Bretonnia, again, heavy cavalry, just runs over the high elves, or sorry, the Wood Elves super hard, and the high elves, same thing, they can outshoot, they've got good heavy cavalry, so in general that one's pretty bad. So 3 and 3 Wood Elves coming in at a score of 0. Next up, we've got the Beardlings, the Dwarves. Yes, indeed. They're going to be good against the Empire and the Vampire Counts, which, for those of you who are perceptive, those are the 2 who haven't popped up on the list yet. So the Dwarves are going to trade very well upwards. They also are good against the Lizardmen in my eyes. Not too great against Chaos, Norska, and the Greenskins, just because they can all bring a lot of really good AP rush builds with chariots and a lot of disruption, and it can be, you know, hard to protect your missiles and everything to really be effective. So in my eyes, those are going to be the 3 toughest matchups for the Dawi. And yeah, Bretonnia is going to be up next. A lot of people seem to think that Bretonnia is not very good. I tend to disagree. I think that they're actually pretty solid overall right now. Good against all 3 of the elf factions and SKAVEN, so those are their favorable matchups. SKAVEN, again, you can just you can really outmuscle them in a way. You can pretty much match them body for body, plus you have some heavy cavalry that will do absolute work against them, so definitely favorable in my eyes against the SKAVEN. And yeah, Chaos, lots of cost-effective anti-large armor piercing means that they're going to be pretty tough for Bretonnia. You know, you've got Kolek, Dragon Ogres, all sorts of elite halberds all over the place, so that one is pretty tough for Bretonnia. Empire has, you know, magic damage, excellent magic itself, AP missiles, just overall a better faction than Bretonnia in my eyes. They're more well balanced, and some of the tools they can bring, in particular in that head-to-head matchup, Faith Demis, for example, and the Hammer of Witches. You know, there's just so many good tools in that matchup that it's really, I find as Bretonnia, you're really kind of behind the 8 ball there. Norska, we talked about that a little bit already, and Vampire Coast, similar to the Empire. Of course, they're not as well balanced, but just that overwhelming shooting, lots of cost-effective anti-large AP and counter cavalry tools. So yeah, Bretonnia definitely struggles in that matchup, but again, against all the elves, and there's plenty of matchups here that are even, that are not listed. So for those of you who are curious, I'm going to be including a link down in the description below to the Google Docs spreadsheet that shows all of the matchups for all the factions. So for those of you who are curious, probably should have mentioned that at the beginning, but anyway, moving on to the A tier. We've got Tomb Kings, Chaos, and the Vampire Coast. So these guys are all powerhouse factions, absolutely. Definitely going to be a staple of competitive play. So Tomb Kings, they've got good matchups against Greenskins, Beastmen, SKAVEN, and Lizardmen. Again, as one of the death factions, they've got that army-wide fear, so they're good against the low leadership factions. They also have the AP missiles to stand and deal with Lizardmen. They're not really great against the Vampire Counts. It used to be the other way around, but the Counts now have enough monster killing power that it's pretty tough to deal with. You know, you're not going to be able to protect missile units. Your elite constructs kind of just get dumpstered by the monsters of the Vampire Counts, so they also just have a lot more raw healing than you do, so they can kind of outgrind you. The Empire, likewise, kind of like we talked about, I don't know, did we talk about before? They have fire damage and AP missiles. We talked about that with Norska, I think. Same thing here, just that well-balanced roster with fire, AP missiles, lots of tools to deal with what the Tomb Kings can bring. In my eyes, means that the Empire definitely has an advantage in this matchup. Moving on to the Warriors of Chaos. They are still a powerhouse faction, not quite as good on the tier list as they did last time, but still. They've got good matchups against the High Elves, Wood Elves, Dwarfs, Bretonnia, and SKAVEN. We've talked about all those already. We haven't talked about the Empire, the Vampire counts yet, but they do struggle against those two factions, in my experience right now. The Empire has really come into their own with Karl Franz just being such a scary duelist. He can really take most Chaos Lords to Pound Town. In fact, pretty much all Chaos Lords he can take to Pound Town. Even Kolek and Archaon. Vampire counts, same thing, because they can take down your monsters and your lords so significantly, you're going to run into some issues there. But yeah, Warriors of Chaos still very, very solid overall. And finally for this tier, we've got the Vampire Coast. Coming in at a +3, these guys have got good matchups against Norska, Greenskins, SKAVEN, Bretonnia, and Beastmen. Again, the low leadership factions, and then Norska and Bretonnia. The AP missiles, the counter cavalry tools you have, just really excellent. They do have bad matchups in my eyes against the High Elves and the Wood Elves, because those are two factions that can both kite and outshoot you effectively, and that's kind of the bane of the Vampire Coast. If you can do those two things, you can really win effectively against them in most situations. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, so again, don't draw too many conclusions from this, but nonetheless, it is still going to be a very, very good ranking for the Vampire Coast. Now, finally, the moment you've all probably been waiting for, and no doubt with the two factions you've figured out, we are on to the S tier, the Realm of the Gods. And again, I am an Empire player, so I might be a little bit biased, but just from the games I've seen, the games I've played and everything, Empire is absolutely top tier, and the Vampire Coast, I don't think anyone will argue, or sorry, not the Coast, the Counts. The Vampire Counts, I don't think anyone will argue that they are absolutely in the top tier. So, for the Counts themselves, they only have one bad matchup, and that is against the Dwarves. They have good matchups against Chaos, Norska, Greenskins, Tomb Kings, Beastmen, and SKAVEN. They're, all the low leadership factions. They're also good against, another death faction in Tomb Kings, Chaos as well. Another powerhouse faction they can take down very effectively. The Dwarves are just, because of their high leadership and their resiliency, I find that they're the toughest matchup for the Vampire Counts, and you really have to come up with some kind of funny different builds to try and win in that matchup. It's certainly, again, none of these matchups are like unwinnable, but this is definitely the toughest matchup, and the only one for the Vampire Counts that I think is really, I would say, not super favorable. And finally, my personal favorite, and again, full disclosure here, I've said this several times, but I do play Empire mostly, I would say more often than any other faction, so I'm probably a bit biased towards them, but in my eyes, the Empire, again, only has a bad matchup against the Dwarves. Those pesky Dwarves, man, just trading so well upwards. But, in terms of their good matchups, Chaos, Norska, High Elves, Tomb Kings, Bretonnia, and SKAVEN. So quite a few even matchups, but quite a few favorable matchups as well, and coming in with a full-on, Imperial, Royal, yeah, not even Royal, full-on Imperial, blessed by Sigmar, +5, absolutely incredible. So hopefully you guys enjoyed watching this. Sort of just threw this together. Definitely you guys will have some disagreements about certain factions, and I more than welcome you guys letting me know your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think of this list? What would be your own tier list if you had to rank the factions, in a given order or just into various groupings? How would you rank them? Just in my eyes, again, some of the factions, as I mentioned, they seem a lot worse than they are. Overall, I would say the game is in a very well-balanced place, and you shouldn't draw too many conclusions from this tier list. I know I've said that several times, but I know people are going to do it anyway, so... fun stuff. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed watching. Again, link down below to the Google Doc if you want to see more. I'm going to keep it coming with more Total War Warhammer 2 content, so if you do want to see more, like, subscribe, hit that bell notification button, so when I upload new videos, you'll be notified. Thank you once again for watching, and we'll see you next time.